Douglas Herbert. Doug, context about this attack that's taken place in Nice this morning. Clearly a lot of anti-French sentiment growing in many parts of the world.
Well, there's been anti-French sentiment, and a lot of it has to do with a sort of parallel universes between sort of the French worldview and the French approach to what has been definitely, yes, a series of alarming terror attacks in recent years. A few years back, back-to-back, a few months back-to-back attacks that killed, as you know, over 200 people. And since then, taking on an almost more individual, people acting on their own initiative as sort of standalone, if you will, jihadists, launching these very random attacks, often in public places, public squares, near churches, wherever, at the behest of someone sort of urging them to act on behalf of a very radical version of Islam. So you have that mindset there. You have a sort of anxiety that has permeated. It's been so pervasive throughout French society, and it's not really even in the back of people's minds. It's really, especially if you live in big cities in France, medium-sized cities, it's always there on your radar, on your mental radar when you go about. So even at a time where the context has obviously been COVID, and even at a time where we're just hours away in France from going into a nationwide lockdown for at least the next month or so, which is, you might argue, anxiety-causing enough for your average person of an average psychological, stability. On top of it, you have this, and you really have a sense of, the sky falling down. And there's a sense from a lot of people looking in perhaps from the outside that there's been something perhaps extra provocative in the way the French leadership has responded to these attacks. From the French perspective, Emmanuel Macron talking about trying to root out what he sees as Muslim extremists, radical Islamism. To the French, that sounds very natural. It sounds very normal. There's nothing particularly controversial about saying that. To someone from the outside looking in, when they hear that, they also realize that these are remarks which necessarily can perhaps polarize society a little more, which can perhaps, even if that's not the intention, can perhaps alienate
French Muslims
who are about, we don't have official stats because there's no census allowed on these ethnic or race figures, but about 8 million about 6 million, French Muslims, about 8% of the population in France. So the two sides never shall meet, and with each of these attacks, you have a situation.
Doug, I'm sorry to cut you off. Church bells across France are tolling. We're going to take a listen.
C'est la petite église qui sonne là-bas à gauche.
Okay, the bells will be tolling.
They will be tolling. But what Delano, what I was saying, with each of these attacks, it's sort of like a drip, drip, drip. And they tend to lend more ammunition to those who already were inclined to take a very hard line against this. And it's not an argument. We're not getting into the arguments of whether or not it's right to take a hard line against these type of acts. Obviously, you have to root it out. Obviously, no one wants to live in cities where you're vulnerable just walking down the street to an Islamic terror attack. The question is how you address it over the long term, and whether what some would say is a knee-jerk short-term response, which is to take that hardest line possible, which is to take that very, very solid law and order line, cracking down, which is what we've seen. That's the mode into which even Emmanuel Macron, who came to power really as a centrist, he has gone more to the right in his rhetoric with respect to these types of attacks. So a France that was already anxious about terror, that was already inclined more and more with each successive attack to say, you got to go get those guys, you got to crack down on them. Less and less tolerance, forget civic rights of the attack, less and less tolerance for this happening at all in society. The problem, broadly speaking, is that it leaves the open question is Emmanuel Macron talks about reforming Islam. In France, because there are imams in France who are French-sponsored, who are French-certified, trained in French schools, sanctioned by the French state. And then you have, as we've been talking about, foreign imams, about 300 of them. A lot of them have come in from Turkey. And in fact, it's been a big part of the plank of the projection of foreign policy, a much more sort of Muslim identity-oriented foreign policy on the part of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, his sending of foreign imams to France. have a situation here where that has become an extremely fiery debate. Emmanuel Macron, though, in saying that he wants to put an end to that, to phase out all of that, the sending of foreign imams in France, in favor of a purely French model of French-trained imams. It sounds like you might listen to that and say, well, what's wrong with that? I mean, if that's going to lead to less radicalization, if that's going to lead to fewer attacks, yes. And it's not one or the other. Yes, you can argue that that is perhaps a sensible move in light of what we are seeing. Yet at the same time, and this is where it gets really tricky, and this is where the polemic starts, is can you do that without getting to the root causes? And that's a whole nother chapter, the Pandora's box, because the second you start trying to say, but the French also need to work on, and it's a difficult task, addressing the underlying causes of why, particularly in French society, why has this happened? Why is this model of integration, if not failed, at least why has it foundered recently? Why is it very shaky and wobbly? What's going on here? Can you address those root causes of discrimination? It's not easy for the French to do that, and it opens up a debate right now that a lot of French aren't inclined to participate in because it's so polarized between those who want the hard line and those who say at the end of the day, you can talk about that, but you have to attack the root causes.
Doug, thank you very much for that. Douglas Herbert there.